I'm pleased so many of you are able to join us today on this, the first of our Friends of Patronato discussions, the first one of 2022. It's great to see this incredible turnout. The other thing I'd like to do is just take a second to acknowledge all of those people who were kind enough to donate to our end-of-year campaign. As many of you will know, that typically we look to our end-of-year concert series as being our major fundraiser that really funds a great deal of the conservation work that takes place across the mission in the year to follow. And due to the great support that we got when we had to pivot again to a virtual concert, our Conservation Committee really sees a path forward with a number of projects this year. So I'd really like to thank you all for your great support to our end-of-year giving program. And for those of you who didn't get a chance to see our virtual concert, do reach out to Kimberly. It's still available. And some of the drone footage that we were able to shoot inside of the mission is just incredible. So with that behind us, it gives me great pleasure to introduce you all to the newest member of our Patronato team, Starr Herr-Cardillo. Starr joined us in September working part-time as Conservation Project Manager. But in fact, her work with us began earlier than that because she was the primary author of the Conservation Management Plan prepared by the University of Pennsylvania School of Design, which we had prepared for us 2019-2020. Starr, as a recent graduate of the Conservation Science Program, led the team who surveyed the mission and prepared the comprehensive 2-volume plan that provides not only an historic overview of conservation activities at the mission to date, but also developed conditions assessment over every section of the mission, and also then began to establish priorities across the campus. And when I refer to the campus at the mission, we're actually dealing with buildings from 3 distinct historic periods. Of course, the most iconic is the 18th century church and mortuary chapel, but as well, we have the 19th century convento wing, began probably around 1805, which is the section that is to the east of the church. That was originally possibly as many as 3 separate buildings, and across time has been integrated into the section that you see now, which contains both the museum and the Juan Diego Chapel. And then the third section of historic significance is the 20th century administrative wing, built by Bishop Grandjohn around 1905. And so all of these are part of the historic footprint of the mission. I should also say, just referring back to Starr for a moment, she's no stranger to Tucson, Arizona, having grown up here. She attended the University of Arizona, where she did her first degrees before going to the University of Pennsylvania to do their conservation science program. So with the East Tower project due to be completed in by Easter of 2020, Easter 2022, we're now entering into a major planning process. This includes several large projects which will launch in the next 2 months, one of which you're going to hear about today. And beyond that, Starr will be working with us to build a larger plan that will define our path towards completing conservation projects across the whole mission campus, bringing every part to the level where projects can be defined as conservation maintenance. And at this time, we're building the time frame, but initial estimates are that that path might be achieved within 7 to 10 years, contingent on funding. So we may be in the last decade of major work at the mission, which is pretty exciting. And so to today's discussion, Starr is going to share with us some of the discoveries she and our conservator team, and in fact, I'd like to welcome 3 of those people who are on today's call. Let me welcome Tim Lewis and Matilde Rubio of Tohono Restorations, and also Patronato's intern, Susie Moreno, all who participated in the research project. Starr's going to share information developed from the team's month-long study conducted on the Facade, which took place during October and November of 2021. Starr's presentation will be about 25 minutes, so if you have questions, if you'd like to drop them into the chat box, which is at the bottom of your screen, it may not show unless you hover your cursor over the bottom of the screen. But if you'd like to put questions there following the presentation, I'll present your questions to Starr. And so without further ado, let me turn proceedings over to Starr Herr-Cardillo.
Great, thanks, Miles. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy that we have such a good turnout for today. And I'm super excited to share this project with you. It's an incredible project to get to work on. Like Miles said, I'm from Tucson. It's a little bit funny that I moved across the country to get, qualified to come back and do this type of work, but I couldn't be happier to be working at the mission. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So even long before we came through with UPenn and did the CMP, the facade has been identified as a priority for quite some time by our team of conservators here. And part of what's interesting about this element, and I just want to clarify that when I'm using the term facade in this context, I'm not talking about the entire south face of the building, but we're really talking about this tan-colored sculpted portion that surrounds the front doors, the facade retablo. And part of the challenge with this element is that it can't be approached exactly the same as other work that's been carried out kind of systematically over the past few decades. It's not a construction project like some of the other exterior work. This is a highly decorative element with remaining original finishes, but it gets a lot more exposure than the interior. And it's also seen different treatments over the years than the interior. So it's not exactly like the other work that our art conservation team is really well versed in dealing with. So it's kind of its own beast, which is why we're beginning this process with a study phase, which we're still in the middle of. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So this is our team. That's me on the left with Matilde, Rubio, Tim Lewis, and Susie Moreno. As Miles said, they are all here today. So I'm hoping they'll jump in the Q&A. And if you have any technical questions, they're great people to ask because they're the true experts on the mission. Matilde and Tim both worked with the team who carried out the first major restoration on the interior in the 1990s. And Susie's actually their niece, and she's been apprenticing with them for the past several years. We also worked closely over the month that we were on the scaffolding with conservator Frida Mateos, who's in the photo on the right. She's based outside of Mexico City, and she's a painting and plaster expert from INA, which is the National Institute of Anthropology and History in Mexico. So she came out and actually spent a week with us on the scaffolding, and in that photo, she's performing a cleaning test. Overall, our group spent about a month from late October to mid-November recording existing conditions, doing some cleaning tests, taking samples, documenting, and otherwise studying the facade. In addition to our core team, we worked with an engineer who considered the structural condition of the engaged columns, the estipite columns. And we worked with a wood conservator who evaluated the condition of the balcony, which is actually a 1950s era reconstruction. We also have been kind of routinely consulting with a group of advisors, people that we consolidated who worked on similar sites and projects and who can help weigh in on the process and who we can bounce some of our technical questions off of, and that's been incredibly helpful. We recognize that another big part of this process moving forward is going to have to be community engagement. Tim was kind enough to organize a scaffolding tour for a group of people from the community. So we had about 8 people come up and see things firsthand, which was really wonderful to share some of those findings, in person. And we had a small courtyard meeting with some of the church members and members of the parish sharing early findings. But as we're planning this, and once we get our final report together, that's definitely something we plan to do, is get out there and share findings broadly and give people the opportunity to weigh in, especially those who live nearby and for whom this church is a sacred place. And we feel that's particularly important for this project because the facade really functions as the face of the church and the gateway to the church. It's rich with symbolism, and as the first gate of heaven, it really gives you a preview for what you're going to find inside. And I'm not going to spend too much time on the symbolism because it's not my specialty and it's a whole topic on its own, but I wanted to give a few detailed shots because it can be hard to appreciate it all from the ground. You have the cat and mouse who are kind of nestled in the two upper scrolls. The cat on the right and the mouse on the left. The monograms for Jesus and Mary on the left and right. And then in the niches, there are 4 saints who are thought to be Saint Barbara, Cecilia, Catherine, and Lucy. And at the top, where the broken pediment is, there's sort of now kind of a makeshift flagpole, but it was once a statue of Saint Francis. And it's debated whether it was Saint Francis Xavier or Saint Francis of Assisi. Bunny Fontana, I think, argues for Saint Francis Xavier, and there's an art historian, Emily Umberger, who's written and studied historic photographs and makes the case that it's a Assisi. So I just say it's Saint Francis to play it safe. And then here on the upper tier, you can see there's the Franciscan escutcheon at the center, 2 guardian lions who flank the columns, the cockle shell above the window, and then lots of scrolling florals. There's some grapes. We think these may be squash or melons, all kind of depicting paradise and sacred guardians. So one of the first steps in our process was to gather historic photographs and arrange them in sequence. We printed them out. We created a binder that we could take up with us onto the scaffolding so that we could reference them and just kind of track changes to different elements of the facade over time. We also gathered written records. We know from early descriptions that it was highly colored. The image on the left is one of the earliest photographs of the church. It was taken in 1867, and it shows that most of the estipites, those engaged columns on the front, are intact. The image on the right is a great one because it's one of the earliest high-resolution photographs we have that shows the statue of St. Francis at the broken pediment. And you can see there's no photograph where he still has a head, but you can make out the torso, and he has 2 arms, one kind of bent up to his chest and one that falls down outside, the layered skirt. So that's, if you're interested in reading up on that debate, you can get in touch with us and we can share. There's a published paper about it, but a lot goes into kind of analyzing this dress and whether it's Franciscan or Jesuit. The image these images are both post-earthquake of 1887, and you can see the image on the left, which was taken shortly after. A number of the estipite columns have fallen off. Even though these are black and white photographs, you can really see the polychrome painting that would have been present. The barber pole striping that kind of goes at a diagonal on the molding that surrounds the that surrounds the facade, and then there's that prominent zigzag design at the cornice. In the image on the right, you can see that the base of the wall has been repaired. Some early repair campaigns, but pre-Grandjon have been initiated. The balconies, the railings of the balconies have been replaced. And then we found this really wonderful set of images. In 1928, Prentice Dwell had the interior and the facade documented using a large format camera. They built a big wooden scaffolding and kind of went around and systematically photographed these sections. So we have 9 kind of, very detailed images that show conditions pre-1950s restoration. And it gives you a great look at those conditions. It gives you really nice, clear documentation of those uppermost estipites, as shown in the image on the right, which did not survive. Prent Dwell also created this speculative watercolor, which he clearly took some liberties with. You can see he's painted a pattern on the domes which there's no existing evidence for, but we know he was looking closely at the facade because he did have those photographs made. So it's interesting to think about, how accurately he would have rendered that. We know the color palette he's used does fit with the colors that we saw: white, yellow, reds, and oranges. And then by 1942, the last two remaining estipites are in pretty deteriorated shape. And there's a lot of discussion that begins to build, and it's all on record at the Arizona State Historical Society. And it's a very interesting glimpse into kind of early preservation thinking. But yeah, there's all this discussion on what to do with them. So they are documented on all sides, and then they're encased in a excelsior dipped in plaster of Paris. So kind of like a mold is made around them. Then they're wrapped in cloth and boards and carefully lowered and placed into storage. They may have been preserved, but the war kind of delayed those efforts. So they actually just sit in storage until the true restoration begins in the 1950s. These images are from a scrapbook that was made documenting the 1950s restoration campaign. And that was really led by Father Celestine Chin and architect Ed Herreras, who was the architect for the city of Tucson. And they began a major restoration campaign across the campus. But when we look at the facade today, what we're seeing is mostly a result of this campaign. And we know, because they kept good records, that they set out with the intention not to drastically alter its appearance. They didn't want to make it look new. They wanted to, quote, restore all portions of the mission to its original and authentic status. And there's actually an entry in this report where Herreras recalls, the last day that the scaffolding's coming down from this project, he overhears some tourists say, "Oh, I wonder if they're gonna fix this part next." And he was pleased, because in his mind, that was the best sign of success, that it didn't look like they had just finished doing this work. It meant they had kind of kept it looking rustic and authentic. But this scrapbook was really valuable to have. In it, they include some of the recipes they use, such as this cactus juice formula recipe seen in the image on the left, where they talk about mixing cactus juice with watercolor to touch up some of the original paint. They document some minor repairs that they made. And then they also replaced all of the estipites with art stone casts. So that's kind of like a cast concrete made from those two remaining originals that were moved in 1942. The original columns were segments of sculpted low fire brick that had a hole in the center that were kind of threaded around a wooden pole. So these cast segments that you see in the photo were installed using rebar and steel straps, and they're strapped in to the wall of the facade. The segments were rotated so that no two look identical. And then Ed Herreras also had replicas of the original balconies made, which we know now that we're looking at those closely aren't 100% perfect replicas, but the idea is, understanding their intent to kind of reproduce authentic work. So a big part of what we were looking at when we were up there for a month was trying to identify these later repair campaigns, differentiate them from the original material. And what we recorded was that there are many areas where original paint and finishes still remain. And I've kind of shown a few examples of what those look like on the left. And then there are many areas that are covered by 1950s era repairs, and those are shown on the right. So in the group on the left, that's St. Barbara on the upper left corner. And her cloak there is one of the best preserved examples of original finish that has this really beautiful kind of scrolly floral detail. And you can see in kind of the recesses of her robe, there's original ochre. And it's really wonderful to see that much preserved. The image just to the right of her shows a detail of that kind of zigzag pattern of the cornice, and it just gives you a sense of what the texture of those original finishes look like. But you can see there's a really robust color there. And then the image on the bottom gives you a sense of, there's a lot of whitewash kind of remaining in the background. We feel pretty clear that the flat portions, the planar portions, would have been lime washed in a white against which the colors would have popped. And you can see how in the kind of crevices of that floral pattern, you can get a sense of the color scheme. Then the group of images on the right, what we saw were different shades and kind of different mixtures of this, tinted stucco that was applied. On the far left, there's a very dark color. You kind of see some of it was a little more structural, some of it was used for the decorative elements. The image on the right, that's a section of that floral relief on the uppermost tier. It's not the most elegant patching job, but overall what we found was that there was a lot more intervention, a lot more kind of coating with this new material along the bottom, which may have been because that was easier to access. It may have been because they were figuring people can see the bottom more clearly. But it was pretty easy to distinguish once we got familiar with things. I think for this reason, we're considering doing a larger test on an area that contains a good representative sample of conditions to better understand what our limitations and options will be. If you can see, there's a straight line on the skirt of St. Cecilia. That's her hand holding the tambourine. Just to the right of the tambourine, you can see one of our cleaning tests. So she's kind of extensively coated in this stucco, and Tim and Matilde have gone in and removed a little bit to see what's beneath. But I think there are still many questions about what we're going to find in some of the more heavily coated areas. Here's a detail showing a bit of that exposed barber pole striping that we found up on along that second cornice. And you can see that 1950s era stucco is just sort of applied over that. This is another interesting piece. This section of the cornice is one of the largest intact sections of original finish. And it's an area where we observed that it almost looks like the paint might have been applied to a wet finish layer. So more like a true fresco than the wall paintings inside where the paint was applied to a dried surface. And we suspect that because in this area, the way that the paint kind of fuses with that preparation layer, you can kind of see in the photograph because you have a rougher plaster substrate that's sort of pulling away from that finish. It looks like they may be almost fused. Another interesting thing we observed is that the relief elements were not simply painted one color, as kind of the restoration implies. There was a lot of color blending and brush strokes that we could see when we got close. So the image on the left was taken on that upper tier with all the scrolls and floral relief. And the image on the right it's the same image, but it's been enhanced using an app called D-Stretch that's actually used by anthropologists to help identify rock art. And what it does is it just applies various filters that help enhance different colors, just helps enhance your perception of different colors. We found that this app actually worked really well to help make those original colors pop because they can be a little bit difficult to read. So the bright yellow and fuchsia that you're seeing in the image on the right are the original finishes. And this app also helped make the repairs pop because that peachy kind of, Matilde was referring to it as peanut butter because it's got a little bit of a smeared texture. That's the 1950s era stucco repair. Here's another de-stretched image that shows again how much is hiding out below that relief and in the cracks and crevices. And here's one more It's just really exciting to be up there for, you know, a number of weeks, because our ability to perceive these finishes really changed with that time and with the lighting conditions. It's very harsh light up there. It can be really high contrast. So when we did have a couple of cloudy days, our group would get really excited and run around taking photographs, because images from the taken in diffuse lighting conditions work really well with this app, but also in person, it just made things pop and made it a lot easier to see. And here's this image once again, because once, you know, we were familiarizing with what we were seeing up there and it was kind of all sinking in, Matilde realized later when we went inside that it was actually very similar to the 2D decorative motifs that we see in there. So the image on the right is taken in the west transept. So we did take a number of samples to have tested. We don't have results back yet from testing. Some went back with Frida to be analyzed in Mexico at a lab that she likes working with, and some are being looked at here at the U of A. The dots in blue on that graphic are samples that were taken in 2008 when Tim and Matilde first did some preliminary study on the facade, and they only had access to certain portions. So we knew from their initial tests the composition of the original finishes or pigments, and we knew some composition of the overpainting. So those were helpful. We kind of built out additional questions with our team to answer with more tests. So we were specifically interested in the strength and composition of the plaster substrate, especially the plaster that was used to sculpt the statues. We wanted to get a full stratigraphy, so a sample that included the substrate plaster layer and then subsequent finish layers, so that we could do a cross-sectional analysis. We wanted to understand the interaction between the finish layers and preparation layer, because it seemed as though pigments may have been applied to a wet preparation layer, as I was saying, at that section of the cornice. And all of these samples were very small and very carefully chosen, and we're excited to see the results. We were also thinking a lot about the colors present on the facade, which we knew from that 2008 analysis were iron oxide red, ochre yellow, manganese black, and lime white, all of which could have been derived locally, as opposed to the interior, which contains some pigments that were imported. So when we were sharing some of our early findings with members from the community, one of the elders commented that those 4 colors are actually sacred to the Tanah Atom. We kind of kept reflecting on that as a group later, and one of our board members, Nancy Odegaard, used to run the conservation lab at the Arizona State Museum. We were talking to her about this, and so she had us come by to look at the museum's collection of pigments and paint technologies. Because she's been working with a grad student who's cataloging the collection. And through that conversation, it came up that there might be a way to, through our analysis, look at the grain size and shape of the pigments found in our samples and compare those with indigenous archaeology from the area. And that might offer additional insight into whether local sources or paint making technologies were used. Another part we're working on now involves putting San Javier's facade in context. So looking at it in relationship to the other Kino missions, many of which have seen various interventions at Tubatama and San Ignacio. Those are the 2 whitewashed churches shown. The facades have been whitewashed as part of a regular maintenance routine, or loss at Cocospera in the upper middle, where the facade is literally being held up by that scaffolding now, and at Tumakakari, where actually original finishes do remain on the facade. They're just not necessarily perceptible to the average visitor. But one thing that's been incredibly helpful is that Alex Lim at Tumakakari has also been working with University of Pennsylvania students over the years who've done studies on the facade. So he's been very generous in sharing some of their work, and it's really helped inform our approach. But yeah, you can see that even though San Javier's facade has undergone some modification, it really still does retain a relatively high degree of integrity. We're also looking at the Franciscan missions in the Sierra Gorda in Mexico, which were built around 30 to 50 years before San Javier, and which influenced its design. There are 5 missions there, which were nominated to the World Heritage List in 2013. And the UNESCO nomination specifically calls out their facades as a quote, manifestation of the joint creative efforts of the missionaries and existing indigenous groups. And you can really see a striking resemblance between these and San Javier in terms of the Baroque style, the motifs, and the color palettes used. A restoration of the 5 missions in the Sierra Gorda was recognized as a priority since the 1980s, and by now they've all been restored. You can see from these contrasting images, it's the same church on the left pre-restoration and on the right post, that it's a pretty noticeable change. Frida, who came out and worked with us, was involved in this project, and it was interesting to see kind of how our thinking as a group emerged over the course of our study. And all of us, including Frida, all kind of felt that this approach didn't really fit at San Javier. For one, we simply don't have the level of information necessary to do such extensive in-painting. While there's a lot of original paint that remains, it would be kind of a stretch to extrapolate and fill all the voids. We've talked about the possibility of doing a conjectural sketch that could be shown on a sign or something that helps kind of visitors understand what it might have looked like. But I think the big question of how much to intervene, you know, whether we restore any elements and how far to go are all of the big questions that remain. And they're questions that will be determined both by technical limitations, feasibility, safety, and a lot of community input. And that's it. I just wanted to end by saying, yeah, that as a living church, there are a wide range of values that need to be considered at San Javier, not just historical and aesthetic, but spiritual and social values and more. And there's not necessarily a singular right answer to questions like these. And what this stage is about is really gathering all of our information, understanding our material risks and limitations, developing historical context, and getting a better understanding of the facade's evolution over time. Yeah, and in doing that, we want to make sure we're talking to people, continuing to check in and discuss things with our advisory group. And Tim is working to put together a group of people from the community who are involved in the church, who can meet regularly with our team and kind of weigh in on issues as they arise. And then we'll just continue to share what we're learning with the broader public too. Thanks for coming. I'm looking forward to hearing questions and comments.
And Starr, just before we move into question and answers, I want to just make people aware, if you came in late, this presentation will be available on our YouTube channel. So if you felt like you missed the first few minutes, it will be available after tomorrow. So with that said, I'm going to go across to questions. And actually, Jenny Krause has asked a question and then wanted it withdrawn, but in fact, it's an important question, Jenny, because this is one of the things that we're having to think about. Jenny asked, will the columns be rebuilt?
It's a great question. I think we all wonder that question, or we all have that question. I mean, interestingly, our engineer felt that they're relatively sound. And when I say relatively, I mean they are sound. As an engineer, being extra cautious, I think there's always, you know, things could always be reinforced more. But I think what we were trying to understand first is, do they pose any sort of risk to the building? And then I think there could be many different answers to that question. And I think those are the types of questions we're going to have to tackle with a larger group and figure out how we want to evaluate that. That's my non-answer to that question.
Well, and of course, one of the issues is that those rebar straps contain metals, which poses somewhat of a risk if lightning strikes the facade. So we are thinking about interventions that would maybe eliminate the metal sections so that they don't pose risks for lightning.
Yeah, I think it's, we do have very good photographic evidence. We also have estipites that are very similar in design on the interior. I think there could be a case made to reconstruct them or to keep them as is. I think kind of the safe route is, in some senses, is minimal intervention, but I think that there's, also a question of defining kind of a sound preservation approach. So if we're thinking we'll restore or reconstruct certain elements, but not others, those are all choices that need to be kind of justified and backed up.
Correct. So Jenny, thank you for your question. You see, there's no such thing as a stupid question when it comes to conservation. Susie has asked, the whole question of polychrome finishes is a hot discussion from classical Greek and Roman artwork, as well as Gothic structures. And of course, this is exactly true. We've grown up to think of Greek sculptures as those pristine marble, white, but in fact, if you see what they were probably like, highly colored, along with the Egyptian sculpt that you would see at the pyramids, again, in their original format, were probably highly colored. And of course, just like the facade at San Javier, across time, they've kind of been interpreted as we see them now. But the whole question of what to do is exactly what we face here at San Javier. Would you like to comment?
Sure. I mean, I think that's one of those, I think that will be an interesting thing to raise in these larger community discussions. I'd be curious to see if, people have grown accustomed to how it is now. And like the work in the 50s, maybe it emerges that there's a value around not altering it too drastically or not making it look too different. Or on the other hand, maybe someone would feel that having this be the really brightly colored, welcoming face of the church is more aligned with, how it would have functioned historically, and that's an important thing to consider. It's another one that could be argued either way.
Right. And in fact, to show just how difficult these discussions are likely to be, at our first board meeting, we ran into immediate problems simply based around cultural ethic. Somebody used the word gaudy and was immediately, it was suggested that what is gaudy to one eye isn't necessarily to another. So it's all of those kinds of cultural sensitivities that will need to be navigated through a series of conversations. And in fact, somebody has asked, what are the next steps? And I think, as Starr mentioned, gathering further information, getting the results back from some of these samples that have gone out, and getting perhaps to a second phase of exploration where we do more detailed analysis of what truly is there and what can be done to really inform the discussion about what will be done. But it's certainly, there's some very interesting discussions lying ahead, I think, is the best way to say.
And I think it's important that those discussions, that I think it's not necessarily, I mean, you can have them in the completely theoretical realm of, just in a vacuum, what would be the correct thing to do. But I think it's also important, that's why we have our team of conservators. Tim and Matilde have so much experience kind of making these calls on different elements inside, and there's ethical considerations from the conservators' perspective around what's correct to do and what's not. And I think framing these conversations as more of a, first we gather the information, we share that, we kind of know what our limits are, when there simply is no record or no information there, we pose that as a limitation and we explain why we find that to be a limitation, and then kind of have the conversation within that context too, not sort of just in the open-ended theoretical.
So Roy has asked, what is the plan, if any, for St. Francis, the blob at the top?
I'm glad to know everybody has the same questions as all of us, because that's a huge one. I mean, that's a real challenge. I think that's one amongst our team. And I wonder if Tim and Matilde do want to chime in to any of these answers, please do. Because I know that's one that the two of them have thought about quite a bit. I don't know how we get them. Yay.
This is Matilde.
We have a couple of ideas. For example, talking about the steepities or everything, how it's going to look later, or the level of intervention of reconstruction or in painting or all that. We are going to have to wait how much original really we discover after the cleaning. When we remove all the cement, it's going to give us more information and more judgment to see, okay, how much we are going to do. About the steepities, I'm remembering now what Anthony Crosby said, is one of our consultants, is a preservation architect. He said, when you finish the facade, you are going to see that the steepities are so ugly that you are going to want to replace them, to do something with them. And I agree. This is going to be a changing process. And also because we have the mentality of conservators, very ethic, but we have to talk also with the members of the parish, the members of the community, and thinking now about St. Francis. St. Francis is putting very few left. But now it's being used in a wrong thing. Nobody remembered there was St. Francis in there, and that's wrong. And I think this is one of the things that maybe I personally will replace or reproduce again. So it's not being used again. Right now it has a cross.
Flagpole.
Oh yeah, there's still the cross from
the Christmas
lights. Yeah.
Or they put a flag. That's wrong. That's a saint. I should be a saint, a representation of a saint. That doesn't mean that we make something that you don't recognize that is a replacement. We can do something very simple, of course, documented very well, and be sure that was reproduced. But in my opinion, ethically, is one of the things that I would replace.
So Larry has asked, where heads and other details are missing on the statuary, how does one determine who is Saint Barbara, Saint Cecilia, Saint Lucy? Isn't it some of the iconic pieces that they hold?
Yeah, that's part of it. I defer to Bunny Fontana's Book of Angels, or A Gift of Angels, goes into that and raises he cites kind of the evolution in thinking. I know they feel fairly confident about Santa Barbara and Saint Cecilia. The other two, it's more of a speculative guess.
No, Saint Lucy's
very clear because she's holding her a bowl, or what is it? A dish with her eyes inside.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so that's very clear.
Yeah. And Saint Cecilia, but Santa Barbara and Saint Catherine, I really don't know.
Yeah,
I know that they are queens and they are martyrs because the crown, and because they are holding the palm of martyr. But that they are really Santa Barbara and Saint Catherine, I don't know.
Yeah.
So Alex Lim, who's our consultant from Tumakakari, is on the call, and he's asking, we get the questions about restoration all the time at Tumakakari as well, and just thanks us for handling questions so well. Thanks for that, Alex. Stephen has asked, I came in late, but heard you not want to get into too much iconography, but are you aware of any great mysteries in the 2D imagery?
Mysteries?
Yeah.
I mean, we found that signature inscribed in one of the scrolls. That was interesting. That remains a mystery. Matilde, can you think of any mysteries?
Well, didn't you discover something about the lions that was new? That they were actually male, female, which was sort of...
Yeah, you could almost tell that one or the other is a male or female, just by the expression on their faces. Yeah, I mean, you can't tell a girl and a boy. Yeah, I mean, they don't have manes, of course, or the boy doesn't have a mane or whatever they call it, the hair. But you can almost tell by the way their expression is, the facial expression.
So Michael is asking, what is more important, beautiful white, better, or color? What holds up better in the desert, color or white? And is there a difference in terms of upkeep and costs?
I think it's really what we find, like Matilde was saying earlier, what we find once we start our initial cleaning of the area. The importance doesn't matter, it's what's actually there. Then we'll go from there, to see where we need. We're not going to, recreate anything or repaint anything where we think it is, but we don't do that on the interior. Why should we do it on the exterior? So we'll just go with what's there and just leave it at that, and go from there and see what we find.
I think in terms of durability too, I mean, the areas of original pigment that we found that were well protected are still very vibrant. They hold up fine. I think the reason it looks tan overall is just all of that accumulated loss, and then the 1950s patching that's kind of meant to match that sandy color. But yeah, the areas of original pigment are actually quite bold and bright still.
Yes, and even where they put the cement plaster or a little bit of lime plaster mixed in with the cement, it was pretty much easy to take off. Where we did a cleaning test, it took me half an hour to do like what was it, Starr, 6x6 or 4x4?
About
size.
that, yeah.
Yeah, and it was fairly easy to take off. I mean, it didn't take off any of the original, surprisingly. It was as if the plaster that they applied didn't really adhere to the wall. It was sort of separated, so we could actually just kind of take it off very carefully. Of course, we didn't force it. We just kind of popped out as it went along with the Dremel drill. But there is a lot of original, like we were saying before, underneath all that plaster. How much, we don't know exactly. We'll find out once we get started.
Okay, Susie is asking, was the blue in the photos accurate?
The blue,
There is no blue.
blue, I wonder what photos she's referring to. There is kind of a bluish black. Matilde, do you want to more about that?
No, I think she refers the photos made with the app. I don't remember the name, but the colors are so. I think she's talking about that. But it was not blue, except the black. The charcoal black is always kind of bluish. When they mix it with lime, it becomes blue. It's the color that we have in Tumacacori, the same in the niches.
Yeah.
That it seems like it's blue, but it's really manganese black or charcoal black.
Yeah, that's the problem with that thing that you did. What was it called? Yeah, it's misleading. We were just discussing that while you were talking. I said to Matilde, I hope people don't get misled by thinking that that's that color or is this color when it's not. I mean, it's just an idea. It's
It's enough
to help us, but not to show, to say that that's what's there.
The real color.
Yeah.
No.
Susie is actually saying, yes, she was referring to the blues that we saw in those enhanced pictures.
Okay, yeah, then that's just an effect. I'm sorry. I try to clarify that when I show those images because I think they are very powerful. But it's really I mean, it's almost like if you're on Instagram or something and you're applying filters to your photos. It's scientific in that it helps. I think if you're using it systematically, it can help you identify certain features, but the way it impacts colors can change depending on lighting conditions and everything. So the blue is just sort of the color it turns the plaster, the shadows. They kind of just help that original finish jump out, and then you can kind of go back to the original photo and look at it there, or it helps you kind of know where to look for original finish. It's not a perfect, super precise tool.
Can I just refer back to Tim and Matilde for a moment, because there is actually blue on the interior of the mission. That's the imported colors you were talking to.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, we have Prussian blue, and we have other blues in the interior, but the blue is a very sensitive color. It will not support the lime plaster, the lime that it burns the color. It's only lapis lazuli, the only pigment that support the action of the lime. We don't have lapis in the facade. It would be so expensive.
So the indigo is actually a natural color, whereas the Prussian blue was the first of the imported man-made.
Indigo is not even a pigment. It's a dye.
It's a dye.
It's a vegetable source dye, really. And then they used to use it as a preparation and then put a expensive color on top. That's why we have so much indigo in the baptistry, because in their minds, probably they were thinking to use later on lapis. It's too expensive. Or even azurite. Azurite is more common in here because we can have it locally.
Okay. Stu asks, is the mission of Patronato to conserve or restore, or is that the question to be answered?
That's the question to be answered. I mean, those words do have very precise definitions, but selecting which approach you're going to take, it can vary. It can vary. It's circumstantial. It can even vary within a project. If we decided to restore the Estipite columns, for example, but then conserve, meaning kind of stabilize what's there and not add back anything to the other elements of relief that we've been looking at. That's kind of represents a hybrid approach. So I think our mission is to do what's appropriate and what's the appropriate kind of changes, but to do our best arriving at the right answer. Unless Matilde, you can weigh in.
No, it's perfect.
And Roy is asking an interesting question for each of you, which might be a fine one to end with. What's the favorite feature of the facade for each of you? I see Roy's managed to stump the panel.
Yeah. Starr, you go first.
Okay, I'll go first. My favorite feature, it's not a singular thing, but how painterly it is what struck me and has stuck with me. Like the details on Santa Barbara's cape or robes, and that detail of the petal that I showed, it felt really special to be up there for a long period of time and get familiar with some of those tiny little details where you could really see the human hand.
Tim, Matilde, anything from you?
I would say I don't really have a favorite as far as, because I take the whole thing as a whole. There,
right.
It wouldn't be what it is if you're just picking out little sections.
Yeah.
I would take the facade as a whole, and then especially when you finish, or when we finish working, doing the conservation work, we'll appreciate it more. But I would just take the whole thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, and Tom has a quick question. Any plans to update the cat? Visitors always can tell the mouse, but the cat is a bit dubious.
No, sorry, we can't. I mean, we normally don't try to recreate stuff. We just fix it and leave it as it is, because that's part of the history of the piece. You know, it's like the saints, their heads are missing. We're not going to recreate them because we never knew what they looked like to begin with. And we're not, I mean, you know, we don't. I always thought it was like that to recreate stuff when I first started. But once I got to know about conservation work, you understand that you respect the piece, especially to the people that made the piece, and you leave it at that. So, you know, we just protect it and hope it lasts another 200 years.
Well, thank you for that, Tim. I see our time is very nearly up. I'd like to close by saying that this is really an exciting time for the Patronato. After 4 decades, we're now entering what might be the final decade of major work at the mission. So it's really thrilling, not just to see that work moving forward, but also planning ways to build a team to ensure that that work continues into the maintenance phase. So we at Patronato like to think of everybody on this call as being part of a team that really, without the interest and support of the people that come to these meetings, we simply wouldn't be making the tremendous headway that we've been making. So thank you so much for joining us today. And for those that came in late, do remember we are going to have this on our YouTube channel. So if you missed sections of it, it will be available. And again, we look forward to seeing you on our next presentation, which should be in the next couple of months. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Starr.
Good job.
Thank you.
Very good. Very good.
Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you.